What happens when a king lies? In Herod's grand palace, music and laughter fill the hall. A young girl dances, captivating everyone. But beneath the celebration, tension simmers. John the Baptist has boldly condemned Herod's unlawful marriage, earning the king's uneasy fear and Herodias' burning hatred. When Herod makes a reckless promise to grant anything the girl asks, the stage is set for a night of shocking choices, where one bold voice and a foolish vow will change everything. And it all began with John, the prophet who dared to speak truth to power, standing alone against a king's pride. John the Baptist stood by the wilderness, a man of unyielding courage and fiery conviction. Clothed in camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist, he ate locusts and wild honey, yet his presence carried a weight far greater than any king or soldier. His voice, unafraid and unflinching, cut through the corruption of the land like a sharp blade. Word of his fearless preaching had reached the palace of Herod. The king, intoxicated with power and indulgence, had taken Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, as his own. This act defied the law and stirred whispers of scandal across the region. Yet Herod continued, confident that none would confront him. None, that is, except John. John did not tiptoe around sin. He confronted the king directly, speaking the truth without hesitation or fear. "It is not lawful for you to have her," he declared, his eyes burning with righteous fire. The words were precise, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. In a court where flattery and silence were the norm, John's boldness stood out like a blazing torch in the darkness. Herod felt a chill. The people respected John, and his voice carried far beyond the walls of the palace. What the king feared was not rebellion, but the truth that stripped away his pride and exposed his wrongdoing. John's courage became a mirror, reflecting the corruption that many tried to hide, and in that reflection, no one could escape judgment. Herodias, however, could not bear it. Hatred and anger consumed her. John had spoken what she could not deny, and she feared the influence he held over the people. Every word, every denunciation, ignited her desire to silence him. Even in the palace filled with opulence and power, John stood alone, unshaken and fearless. The tension between the king and the prophet grew with every passing day, a storm waiting to break. And that storm was about to arrive, fueled by a king's pride, a mother's wrath, and a promise that no one in the palace would forget, a promise that would set the stage for one of the most shocking events in history. Herod paced the marble floors of his palace, a crown heavy upon his head, yet a weightier burden pressed on his conscience. The words of John the Baptist haunted him. "It is not lawful for you to have her." Every time he recalled the prophet's voice, firm and unwavering, a shiver ran down his spine. Herod had anger in his heart, yet beneath it, a deep unease simmered. The prophet was no ordinary man. He spoke truth not to gain favor or power, but because he believed in righteousness. His holiness was evident to all who listened, and even the king could not deny it. John's influence over the people was formidable, and Herod, though a ruler of armies and lands, knew that confronting John openly could stir unrest or even rebellion. So, a strange tension settled over the palace. Herod felt the stirrings of fear and respect intertwined. He hated being challenged, yet he could not bring himself to harm John without cause. And so, the prophet was confined, not executed, not silenced, but protected in the prison, a cage that was both a shield and a warning. Inside the cold, dark cell, John remained unbroken. The chains and bars could not touch his spirit, nor could the grandeur of Herod's palace diminish his resolve. He continued to speak truth quietly to those who visited him, offering guidance and calling hearts back to righteousness. Even from the shadows of confinement, John's presence was a light that pierced the darkness of sin and pride surrounding the king. Herod, meanwhile, wrestled with conflicting emotions. Anger battled fear, Authority clashed with conscience. He admired John secretly, even as he resented him openly. The king's pride would not allow him to acknowledge it, yet he could not ignore it either. And so, John remained alive. But the palace was tense with anticipation. Everyone sensed that this uneasy balance could not last forever. A king bound by fear, a prophet bound by truth, and a queen driven by hatred. These forces were on a collision course, and the next move would spark a chain of events that no one in the palace could escape. In the shadows of Herod's palace, Herodias seethed. Every word John the Baptist had spoken against her marriage echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat, each repetition fueling her anger. The prophet had exposed her sin, stripped away the veneer of respectability, and left her vulnerable in a court that whispered of shame and scandal. Her hatred for him burned hotter than any royal feast or jewel-studded hall could ever convey. Herodias was cunning, and her resentment was patient. She did not act rashly in the light of day. Instead, she plotted quietly, weaving schemes like a spider spinning a web. John's fearless words had embarrassed her in front of the king and the nobles, and she could not forgive. To her, silence was not enough. He must be removed entirely, and the thought of his continued influence over the people was intolerable. Every glance Herod gave John stoked her fury further. She despised the king's uneasy respect for the prophet, viewing it as weakness. How could a ruler tolerate someone who spoke truth so boldly, someone whose moral authority rivaled even the crown? Herodias' mind raced with possibilities, each more devious than the last, imagining a world where John's voice was finally silenced forever. And yet, her hatred was not just personal, it was political. John's unwavering conviction threatened her control and the power she wielded alongside Herod. She knew that if the prophet continued to speak, he could sway the people, disrupt the delicate balance of the palace, and even challenge the king's authority. Herodias' eyes darkened whenever she thought of him. Every day that John remained alive was a reminder of her shame, a thorn embedded deep in her pride. Her desire to eliminate him grew with each passing hour, shaping her thoughts and actions, until plotting his downfall became an obsession she could not ignore. In the quiet corners of the palace, her hatred festered like a storm gathering on the horizon. And soon, that storm would strike, setting into motion a chain of events that would shock the palace, silence a prophet, and leave a mark on history that no banquet or celebration could erase. The palace shimmered with gold and candlelight, the walls echoing with the melodies of flutes and harps. On this night, Herod's birthday, the grandeur of the court reached its peak. Nobles in ornate robes, military commanders with gleaming armor, and the leaders of Galilee gathered, their eyes glinting with curiosity, ambition, and expectation. Servants moved swiftly, carrying trays of wine and delicacies, filling the air with the scent of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and exotic spices. Laughter and chatter danced across the hall like a living tapestry, weaving a scene of celebration and indulgence. Herod sat upon his throne, the crown heavy yet unbothered, as he surveyed his court with the satisfaction of a king secure in power. Yet beneath the surface of the glittering feast, tension lingered. A quiet, almost invisible undercurrent that spoke of danger and desire, of secrets waiting to be revealed. The guests, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows, raised their goblets in honor of the king. Music swelled, and the hall seemed to pulse with life, yet the air was thick with anticipation, a subtle tremor that hinted at the chaos soon to come. Every eye turned as the young girl, Herodias' daughter, stepped forward. Her movements were precise, graceful, and mesmerizing. She danced not merely to entertain, but to command attention, drawing the gaze of nobles and soldiers alike, every gesture choreographed to perfection. Herod's pride swelled with pleasure, and the king's heart leapt with delight at the spectacle. The night was meant to honor him, to display his wealth and influence. Yet fate had other plans. Behind the glitter and applause, Herodias' hatred simmered, and John the Baptist's words echoed quietly in the minds of those who remembered the prophet's fearless warnings. In the midst of laughter and music, the palace held its breath, as if sensing that this night, filled with revelry, ambition, and desire, would become the setting for a decision that would forever change the lives of a king, a queen, a prophet, and a young girl whose dance would set the stage for one of history's most shocking moments. The hall was alive with music, laughter, and the echo of applause as Herodias' daughter concluded her captivating dance. The young girl stood, poised and radiant, the glow of candlelight reflecting off her flowing gown. Every eye in the palace was fixed on her, yet it was Herod's gaze that lingered longest. His pride and indulgence had reached a peak, and in a moment of reckless exhilaration, he spoke words that would forever alter the course of events. "Ask me for anything you wish," he declared, his voice booming through the grand hall, "and I will give it to you, even half my kingdom." The statement hung in the air, dazzling in its extravagance, yet weighted with peril. In his intoxication with flattery and pleasure, the king had bound himself with a promise that he could not retract, a vow made to a child guided by the cunning of her mother. Herod's nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Some murmured quietly, sensing the danger in the king's rash words. Military commanders shifted in their seats, their hands tightening around the hilts of their swords, though none dared challenge the monarch. In the glittering palace, beneath the chandeliers and the gilded decorations, tension now threaded through the celebration, invisible but potent. Herodias' eyes sparkled with cruel satisfaction. The oath he had uttered was precisely what she had longed for, a tool to ensure the downfall of the man who had dared to condemn her sin. The girl's innocence was a mask, her obedience a weapon. Herod, in his pride and excitement, had handed her the power to demand whatever her mother desired. Even John, confined behind prison walls, could not foresee the full reach of this foolish oath. Yet the king's words had set in motion an unstoppable chain of events. A promise made in indulgence, driven by pride and vanity, would soon collide with righteousness, courage, and vengeance. In the glittering hall, the celebration continued, unaware that the night's joy concealed the approaching storm, a storm that would test the king, the queen, and the prophet, and mark history with an unforgettable act of cruelty. The music faded slightly as the young girl returned to her mother's side, her delicate hands clasped tightly. Herodias' eyes gleamed with quiet triumph, the culmination of weeks of simmering anger and careful plotting finally within reach. Every graceful step, every obedient nod from her daughter had been orchestrated to serve a single dark purpose: to silence John the Baptist forever. Salome, though only a girl, bore the weight of her mother's command. She glanced up at Herod, who still sat enthralled by the spectacle, and in a voice both innocent and resolute, she spoke the words that would chill the hall. "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter." A hushed silence swept across the banquet. The music faltered. Noblemen and soldiers froze mid-laugh, their eyes wide with disbelief. The words, so simple and yet so horrifying, hung in the air like a shadow cast over the entire palace. Herod's joy faltered, replaced by a flicker of horror. The gravity of his rash promise now crashed upon him, heavier than any crown or sword could bear. Herodias' face revealed nothing but satisfaction. Her scheme had succeeded. Through her daughter's obedience, she had manipulated the king's vanity and pride into granting a request that no ruler could refuse without shaming himself in front of the court. Her hatred for John had been cunningly masked beneath layers of strategy, patience, and cunning, and now it was about to be executed. Herod, though shaken, could not retract his oath. He had spoken it before everyone, a king bound by his own words, his pride and fear intertwined, leaving him paralyzed with indecision. Meanwhile, the courtiers murmured nervously, sensing the darkness about to unfold, knowing that the king's palace, normally a place of celebration, was about to witness a moment of shocking cruelty. And so, With a single request whispered by a young girl, the fate of John the Baptist was sealed. The palace, bathed in candlelight and laughter just moments before, had transformed into a stage of impending tragedy. One bold voice, one foolish promise, and one mother's relentless hatred would combine to set history on a path none could have predicted. Herod froze, the words echoing in the grand hall like a chilling wind. The head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king's heart pounded in his chest, caught between the oath he had made in pride and the horror of the request itself. Every noble, every commander, every servant in the room waited, their eyes locked on him, sensing the weight of the moment. For a brief moment, Herod's mind raced. He remembered John's fearless rebuke, the prophet's piercing words that had stirred both respect and fear. Deep inside, the king knew John was righteous, holy, a man who spoke truth without compromise. And yet, the king's word had been spoken before witnesses. His foolish promise now bound him tighter than any chain. Herodias' satisfaction was palpable. She leaned forward subtly, her eyes fixed on the king, silently urging him to act. Pride battled fear in Herod's heart. To refuse would be to undermine his authority, to risk public shame before the nobles and leaders of Galilee. To comply, however, meant committing a deed he would forever regret, a stain upon his conscience and his legacy. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, Herod made his choice. He nodded toward his guards, his voice low yet firm. "Bring him, as she has asked." The silence in the hall deepened, every listener frozen in disbelief. Even the music seemed to falter, as though the palace itself recoiled at the weight of the king's command. John, in his prison, remained unaware of the decision made in the gilded hall, yet the threads of fate were already weaving a path that could not be undone. Herod's reluctant compliance was the final act of a chain set in motion by pride, fear, and a mother's unyielding hatred. The banquet, once a scene of celebration and delight, had transformed into a stage for tragedy. The king, bound by his own words, had delivered a sentence that would echo through history. And so, the moment that had begun with dance and music now carried the dark certainty of impending death, a stark reminder that even kings in their folly could be instruments of cruelty. The candlelight flickered across the opulent hall, casting long shadows on the marble floors. In the midst of the celebration, a darker spectacle unfolded, a chilling reminder of the deadly price of pride and hatred. The executioner emerged from the corridors, his heavy footsteps echoing ominously as he carried the feared and final token of Herodias' scheme. The head of John the Baptist, neatly placed on a polished platter. Salome, trembling but obedient, stepped forward. The crowd watched in horrified silence, the music of the banquet fading into an uneasy murmur. The young girl's hands shook slightly as she received the grisly gift, her eyes wide as the reality of her mother's command came into stark focus. Though she bore no malice herself, she had become the instrument of a plot steeped in vengeance, cruelty, and relentless ambition. Slowly, deliberately, Salome approached her mother. Herodias' eyes glimmered with triumph, a cruel satisfaction lighting her features. Without a word, the girl handed the platter to her, placing it carefully in her mother's hands. The act, simple in motion yet horrific in consequence, was the culmination of hatred, pride, and manipulation. The court, once filled with laughter, now held a hushed tension. Whispers rippled among the nobles and soldiers as the realization of what had transpired settled over them. Even Herod, seated on his throne, felt a deep unease twist in his chest. His reckless oath, his indulgence, and his pride had enabled a crime he would forever regret. The weight of the king's foolish promise pressed heavily, a stark reminder of the dangers of power wielded without wisdom or restraint. Herodias lifted her gaze, triumphant yet relentless, her eyes meeting the horrified faces of the courtiers. The head of John the Baptist, a prophet who had spoken truth without fear, now lay as a grisly testament to her cunning and vengeance. In that moment, the palace, the scene of music, dance, and celebration, was transformed into a haunting stage of human ambition, sin, and the consequences of unchecked pride. The story of John's courage, Herod's folly, and Herodias' hatred would echo through history, a chilling reminder that even in the grandest halls of power, truth and justice can demand the ultimate price. The halls of Herod's palace, once alive with music and celebration, now felt cold and empty. The echoes of the gruesome banquet had faded, but the weight of what had transpired lingered like a shadow over the king. Herod, seated alone in his opulent chamber, stared at the flickering candlelight, yet it offered no warmth, no comfort. Every laugh, every cheer from that night was now replaced with a gnawing unease, a restless whisper that haunted his mind. Though John the Baptist had been silenced, his presence remained in Herod's conscience. The courage and truth of the prophet's voice, once defiant and unyielding, now echoed endlessly in the king's thoughts. Pride, fear, and guilt collided, creating a storm of unease that Herod could not escape. Even the luxuries of his throne, the power of his crown, and the obedience of his court could not quell the gnawing torment within him. Time passed, but the shadow deepened. Rumors of a man preaching with authority, performing miracles, and challenging the spiritual leaders of the land reached Herod's ears. Whispers of Jesus, powerful yet humble, stirred a strange mixture of awe and dread within him. Could it be John risen from the dead? The thought gnawed at him relentlessly, the memory of the prophet's fearless words haunting every quiet moment. Herod's guilt became a silent companion, a constant reminder that even kings are not free from the consequences of their deeds. Every decision made in pride or fear carries weight, and the king began to understand, too late, that the price of a rash oath and a vengeful heart could never be fully escaped. In the end, the shadow over Herod was more enduring than any sword or prison. It was the weight of conscience, the haunting memory of courage confronted with cruelty, and the inescapable knowledge that truth cannot be destroyed by fear or power. Even as he ruled with wealth and influence, the story of John the Baptist lingered, a chilling reminder that righteousness and courage leave marks that no throne, crown, or palace can erase. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that courage and faith can shine even in the face of powerful enemies. Want to hear more unforgettable Bible stories like John the Baptist's bold stand? Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss the next inspiring lesson from God's Word. And before you go, comment your thoughts. Which part of this story impacted you the most? John's fearless rebuke, Herod's foolish oath, or the shocking demand for his head? We'd love to hear your perspective.